Hello, I'm Julian Whittle from Cumbria Chamber of Commerce, and I'm here with Andrew Atherton, Professor of Enterprise and Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Lancaster University, who is an expert in SME policy. Andrew, Cumbria's economy is in pretty good shape by and large, particularly the M6 corridor through the east of the county, while Barrow and West Cumbria are and always have been less prosperous, certainly in recent years. Is that a fact of economic life? Do you see it ever changing?
So I wouldn't call it a fact of life, because of course that then means that things can never change, and we don't want to get into that sort of way of looking at the world. I think there are probably two broad questions. I mean, one of them is, what are the structural problems that mean that less connected and more remote parts of the UK can have and can deal with? And then the second one is actually the more positive question around what can be done. What's clear from the Northern Powerhouse discussion and the delegation of powers to cities and to local economies is that what the project at the moment is to try to give more decision making and more autonomy locally.
Yeah.
So I think in the short term there are structural problems. In the medium term, trying to build a stronger voice for local autonomy and ability to shape your own future. And then in the longer term, integration has got to be the solution to that. So I think Barrow West Cumbria won't be able to do it on their own, but if they join up with other parts of the economy, so South Lakes obviously, but the rest of Cumbria perhaps even beyond, then that's probably long term the solution to some of those challenges.
I mean, you said, you described them, I don't think anyone would argue with that, as less well connected. Would investment in transport and digital infrastructure be transformational for these less connected places? I'm thinking, particularly for Barrow and West Cumbria, say, of the Northern Tidal Power Gateway's proposal for crossings of Morecambe Bay in the Duddon Estuary, which would dramatically improve travel times from Barrow and Millom and places like that to the rest of the world, as it were.
So, I mean, big exciting projects like this they always get people excited, and they always get people to think this could really transform things. I mean, I would split your question slightly. So I would make a distinction between transport infrastructure investment on the one hand and digital investment on the other.
Right.
And I think there is a bit of a challenge around transport infrastructure investment, in the sense that clearly any major investment, and it would be a major investment, whether it's across the bay or round the bay on the land in terms of either road or rail, it's got to work on population sizes and densities, because there would need to be some kind of private investment into that, and it would be difficult to see how there would be a private sector financial return to a major capital investment into somewhere where population densities aren't particularly high. So I think
of course, part of the rationale for that is that it's energy generating as well as being a road crossing, and it could also potentially carry the high voltage cables from a nuclear power station at Moors.
It could, and I think all that's great, but the question I would ask is, do the numbers still stack up or not? Yeah. And there are examples in other parts of the UK about projects around tide barriers and estuaries and so on, and I don't think we've found a place in the UK where actually they've moved from an idea to a project. So, and I think that's because when people look at the fundamental economics of it, it's very difficult to get them to add up.
Yeah.
I think the real key, and it's the thing that I talked about at the annual dinner for the South Lakes, was digital connectivity is the most important driver of any form of economic growth and any form of economic integration. And I think it's an opportunity, but it's something that the UK needs to take even more seriously than it does. There is no reason why any business can't set up anywhere in the UK, and we'll maybe talk about this a little bit later on, if they've got sufficient connectivity and sufficient bandwidth around that connectivity. There are lots and lots of examples of highly entrepreneurial businesses that can become less spatially constrained because they've got the e-connectivity that means that they can trade all over the world, not just all over a country or a part of a country. So to me, the key is digital connectivity. If we get that right, and although we're making progress, I think we're not at a level of connectivity that you see in some other parts of the world, then that will address some of these fundamental issues that we're talking about.
Okay, well, I'd like to explore that a bit more. I mean, when you mentioned you spoke at the recent Cumbria Chamber South Lakeland Partners dinner, and one of the intriguing ideas you raised at that was that Cumbria could benefit as businesses move out of London, but because of the high costs, the congestion and the high costs of operating there. Can you expand on that idea and say what sort of businesses might actually come to Cumbria?
Yeah, so I think what's very clear is if you look at the structure of the UK economy and you look at the structure of most advanced economies, they've changed a lot over the last 20 to 25 years. So you go back to 1997, there were then around 2.5 million businesses in the UK. There are now around 5.5 million. There are around 2.5 million businesses in the UK. There are now about 5.5 million. Now, the majority of those are self-employed, single sole traders. But the point is that the landscape of the business structure of the UK has changed, and it's moved, and this started in the 60s and 70s. It's moved over the last 5 decades from an economic structure focused on large corporates looking at economies of scale and size, through to an entrepreneurial economy where actually what you can see is people who can set up and create their own businesses because they've identified an opportunity that adds value. And the digital revolution, the introduction of apps and online software has accelerated and reinforced that. And it's really interesting if you look at London, for example, now. The economic vitality of London is based on highly entrepreneurial, highly creative people who are thinking about tech-based solutions to things that not that long ago were not online and didn't have the kind of solutions that are being developed. And you now have US investors from Silicon Valley, you now have Chinese investors from Shenzhen and South China who are in London trying to find that entrepreneurial talent. And the only reason that it's in London is because actually there's been a social cluster that's been operating there for a while. And it's that classic thing. It's not because it's better to run your business in London. It's because actually people come out of certain businesses or people want to talk to each other. Now, I think the interesting thing is you see that in the early stages of the emergence of new industries. But as they develop and mature, they look for alternative models and approaches, and they become much more able to think about what those business models mean. So the importance of place in somewhere like Silicon Roundabout near Elephant and Castle in London was probably incredibly important in the early 2000s when there weren't as many tech-based businesses there, and fintech around Finsbury Square and places like that. Now that it's more mainstream, now there are more businesses, actually that importance of place becomes a little bit less, firstly. Secondly, it's still expensive to live in London. And thirdly, and I think we underplay this, a lot of people who become entrepreneurs, they do it for a couple of reasons. They it's a bit of a myth, everybody becomes an entrepreneur to become a millionaire and get rich. And yes, of course, there is a desire for a financial return, but in general, most of the research has said that there are 2 reasons. The first one is to create something yourself. So the business is a project, and to create something exciting and interesting. And then the second is to build a quality of life because you've created that project that is the kind of quality of life that you want. Now, if you think about the 2 points I'm making, that space becomes less important as these new sectors emerge, and then you think about people setting up really interesting businesses because they're interested in the business but they want to have a certain way of living. Places like the Lake District, parts of Cornwall, places where you can have a really great quality of life. It doesn't cost quite as much to be able to operate your business there, but you can still be connected into London or to Manchester or wherever, and it's not too difficult to get to, become increasingly attractive. And I mean, if you take the UK as a whole, because of the connection to West Coast Main Line, because of the M6, because of the quality of life in the Lake District and housing, because there's a strong income and community and movement of populations in and through, to me it's one of the most attractive places for people to then think about, if you're going to move out of London, where would you move to? And and people, we talk about lifestyle businesses in a slightly negative way about people just running a business for themselves. All businesses are lifestyles, because the minute you set up a business, that's your life.
Yes. Yeah.
But actually, businesses become a means of having the kind of lifestyle that you might aspire to and want, in terms of the quality of the outdoor environment you get in the lakes and so on. So from that perspective, you can see, and very anecdotally, I can see it when I take the train down to London. You can see more people who clearly operate and located outside London, but use the connectivity to London when they need to, but do a lot of it online and digitally as well. So I think, from that perspective, there are huge opportunities. But the question then to ask is, does Cumbria and do the South Lakes present themselves in that way? And do they create an environment where, if you're a highly successful fintech or digital entrepreneur in London, but your kids have got to a certain age, or you are really into climbing or outdoor pursuits, or you want to live in a place that has less pollution, or you want to have a different kind of housing, sort of option, do you think, well, I could go and run my business very, very easily from the Lake District in the South Lakes? Or do you have to go through that process for yourself? And I think that's the opportunity, but that's the bit that's maybe not quite exploited or tapped into as much.
So what does Cumbria need to do to make itself more attractive to these potential relocators from London and elsewhere?
I mean, in a way, I could sort of run through a whole set of standard, sort of responses to that. I mean, I would make two broad points. One of them, let's just use a slightly different example. In Cardigan in West Wales, there are two companies that are very interesting. There's a company called Howie's, and there's a company called Hyatt Denim. And actually, Hyatt Denim are very successful at the moment because Meghan Markle was seen in public wearing a pair of Hyatt denim jeans, and since then they've had the real problem of having a huge increase in demand for their products, to the point where they're having to move out of what was the old original Dewhurst factory that made jeans for Marks and Spencer's, to build more capacity around it. Now, they went to Cardigan because of the Dewhurst factory and the skills that were there, but there weren't that many skills there. They also went there, and you can see it through the way they present themselves as businesses, because the quality of life that the people who set up that business and work in that business, mountain biking, surfing, green environment. So, I think the point I'm trying to make is, there are more and more businesses and entrepreneurs, and you can see it right the way through. Innocent Drinks was a very good example of it, that talk about how they do business as much as what business that they do. And I think tapping into that is exactly where the Lake District could and should position itself. I think there's also a little bit that can be done about quality of life, and not quality of life in a abstract way, but quality of life that, if I come and run my business here, what do I get out of it? And I think that's the interesting thing, is how can that be personalised? How can that be made real for an individual? Because, of course, the real nervousness about moving out to London is you lose your contacts, you lose your networks, and the upside of moving out isn't quite as clear. So helping really, high potential, exciting entrepreneurs to realise they can get as much and more from not living in London, but at the same time still having access and connectivity back through, but also having other opportunities as well, I think is where it is. So it's kind of a pitch, but it's more of a personalised pitch. It's not a standard economic development inward investment approach which we've used in the past. It's much more about getting people excited about living in a wonderful place.
So where do you see growth in the Cumbrian economy coming from in future years? I mean, is it the businesses that are already here growing organically? Is it startups? Is it going to be inward investment? Which of these do you think is going to be the most important?
So, just to step back from that a little bit. I mean, historically, there's been a big focus about rebalancing the UK economy by getting existing actors and players to move from the prosperous parts of the UK to the less prosperous parts, so from the southeast to the rest of it. And certainly if you look at some of the regional development companies that predated the regional development agencies, a lot of that, Northern Development Company would be an example in Newcastle, did a lot of that. The problem is a lot of those corporate investors are footloose, in the sense they then often can move as well, and so they don't embed themselves in the local economy. I mean, some do, so it's not as if they all don't, but maybe not enough do. So the only long-term solution for economic growth and prosperity is about encouraging new entrepreneurs to start their own businesses, and then for them to grow them and to stay local and provide them for that. So I think that the key is to do that. Now, there are some challenges around that, and one of the big challenges in the UK is only a small proportion of people ever set up and run their own businesses, and a smaller proportion of those businesses that start up are then successful. So the broad data is between 5, 6 and 8% of people in active economic activity are setting up and running their own businesses. So if you rely just on Indigenous entrepreneurs, it's going to be a challenge, but obviously that's a key group to be focusing on. So I think the first group is Indigenous entrepreneurs, people who are already living in and around the lakes and South Lakes, but there won't be enough of themselves. The second group, which we've talked about already, are these incomer entrepreneurs, and I wouldn't underplay the importance of Manchester now increasingly as an economic node and focus as well, and again, Manchester is much more accessible from the lakes than London, but they're still highly accessible. I think we forget how small a country we are in terms of travel and how accessible that makes it at times. And then I think the third group, and I think this is an interesting group, are the returners. So there are a lot of people who are net exporters. I mean, lakes and places like that are net exporters of 18-year-olds to other parts of the UK. Life priorities change. Those are people who, if they've been successful enough in their jobs and careers to go and get employment and go and have successful careers in places like London or Manchester or Birmingham or wherever, they have a lot to bring back. And I think that that's the group that, again, you can attract back. They often still have friends and family locally. They might then get to a point where they've got kids, and being close to grandma, granddad and so on makes a big difference, and so on. So I think, again, I think that's the key group. So to me, the solution, there's no single easy magic bullet, but I think the solution is encouraging and supporting more people who are already local Indigenous entrepreneurs, not just to start their business but to grow them. Encouraging people to come into what is a wonderful part of the world to live in and work in, if that's got right, and then thinking about these returns. And I think all three of them together is the solution. Now, that's more complicated. There's a little bit more of a challenge, but it gives more spread and more opportunity and diversity as well.
Okay. Now, some interesting stats that I came across is that overall Cumbria has fewer business startups per head of population than the national average, but the survival rate for the ones that do start is better than average. Why is that, do you think?
So I think it's, so if you let me answer that in the reverse sense. So if you look at a major urban economy, what you tend to see, a big city, what you tend to see is a very high rate of startups, but a higher rate of closures. So there's a lot of churn. People are trying things out, and that's because the labour market and job opportunities are more dynamic. So people might try out starting and run their own business because they're interested in it, but they also might use it as a transition between jobs or as a way of building and experiencing skills. Obviously, in a more rural, less concentrated, less dense economy like the lakes and other parts of non-urban UK, there's less of that intensity and concentration of economic activity. So in that situation, it is a little bit more difficult to start your own business because you've got less of that, fewer consumers, less overall economic intensity. So it's inevitable that it's going to be a little bit less likely that people start a business. But probably also what it does indicate is that if people then are serious about starting a business, they've thought about it more carefully, and so they've thought about what is needed to not just to survive but to grow and be successful in rural areas which have a smaller population, tend to have a lower income per person and GDP per capita than the many larger cities, and so in a way perhaps they're a little bit more prepared. And actually what you see in the data is that it's the survival rates of the survivors that's the big difference in places like the lake. So you go through the first 36 months, it can be quite challenging, but those businesses that get through that first 36, 42 months then have been able to establish themselves and have business models that can then survive for quite a long time. So it's a different dynamic. What that means is that the surviving businesses then tend to be higher quality businesses as well, and so actually there's more that can be done with them, so there's other opportunity there.
What can we do to make Cumbria maybe like more entrepreneurial, to encourage more startups?
So to me, it's not so much about encouraging more startups. I mean, encouraging more startups is less of an issue. I think it's about improving and working with people to enhance the quality of the business startup. So maybe a bit more time around preparation, maybe a bit more time about raising more funding, maybe a bit more time in terms of building some of the support structures and processes around it. And I think that's the key, actually. So it's the quality of the starts that is perhaps as important as the number of people starting businesses. I think the real trick and challenge is actually not startup, it's about scale up. And I think that the bit that the UK doesn't do quite as much as, say, the US does is in terms of scaling up successful businesses. So you see some very good businesses start up, but then, and it's not just the finance, it's about market access, it's about mentoring and coaching to really think about ambition and scale of the ambition around it. And, to me, if there were two strategies, three strategies. The first one would be to encourage more people to think about starting a business, which is great. But that in and of itself isn't enough. The two key components to it are working with people who are starting their businesses or thinking about it to make it as high a quality and as possible a business startup, give them more time for preparation, give them more support around it, and then this scale up point, really focusing on some of those that are really good starts, new businesses, and thinking about how they can move very quickly from quite small businesses to really quite large businesses in a short period of time.
Okay. Now, it's 10 years since the financial crisis. Do you think access to finance is still a problem for businesses? And could that be holding back growth? And that you're talking about the fact that we're not terribly good at getting businesses to scale up. Is that is access to finance part of the problem?
So again, I'll qualify that slightly. Clearly, banks and related financial institutions have had a little bit of political and government pressure on them to lend more to small businesses. It's an ongoing issue about whether they lend enough. It's always challenging for a lender or an investor to invest in or lend to a new business because it's unproven. So there's a risk dimension to it, and certainly there's more that can be done to encourage more risk-based investment, in a sense that not to take on the risk but to start thinking about where those businesses might get to in the future and investing in that future potential. So yes, and I think that's been an ongoing structural challenge, not just in the UK but in other countries.
Interesting. I'll butt in with a point that came across when we consulted on the industrial strategy last year. This came up, and what businesses told us is that the problem is for small businesses who need access to finance because the amount of the money they need isn't big enough to justify the bank doing due diligence on the business plan and looking at it as a serious business venture. They just look at it. Well, is there security? If there is, we'll lend. If there isn't, we won't. Whereas when you move up and you're dealing with larger businesses who obviously need larger sums of money, then the banks there will sit down, analyse the business plan, and back it if they think it's a goer. It's the smaller businesses that are really struggling. Yeah.
So I think that's a good point. I think there are a couple of sort of thoughts around that. The first one is that all credit and investment decisions don't need to be based on full due diligence. And actually, if you look at the investment industry in the US, for example, they'll invest quite large amounts, much larger than some of the loans or investments that you're talking about with smaller businesses, without full due diligence, because they believe in the business or they feel there's real potential or the market's there or there's consumer demand for it. So I think there is a place for more informed decisions to be made without full formal due diligence. And in fact, if anything, if you look at the investments that make real return, it's about getting in quickly before other people do, and so a formal due diligence might not help make the return in the quick emerging and real star businesses that are coming through. So I think there is something around how that's done. I also think that there's a side that if you are a relatively new small business and you are high quality, then it's in the interests of funders to build longer-term relationships with you. So I would flip it slightly, and I would see any funder as being influenceable around relationship development. And I think if you can get them on board with the project, and if you can get them to understand where you're going and see for themselves, but also through your engagement as a small business with them, the opportunities around it, then I think that can reframe the question. Your fundamental question you asked about scale up is it's hugely cash hungry, and there are certain points if we want to get businesses that do what they do in the US, where they go from nothing to Fortune 100 and 500 companies within 5 to 8 years or 10 years, as has been the case. And you look at the Fortune 100 now, as it's something like less than 20% of the value of it was in the Fortune 500 in the mid to late 80s because of the level of change and turnover in the structure of the US economy. Then there are going to be key stages where a huge amount of cash will need to go into those businesses because they'll be eating the cash to grow that quickly to scale up. And I think that's more of a structural challenge. I mean, if I was to talk about a real structural challenge, do we have the institutions that can do that? And that's the broader point that maybe needs to be made.
So a change of culture is required by banks and other lenders, do you think?
Yeah, and also maybe a sort of a conversation around, if we want the unicorns, as they would be called, so the over $1 billion tech companies, how do they move from being a rapidly growing 10, 15, 20% per year, 50, 60, 80 million turnover business to that 1 billion plus in 5-6 years, and what are the requirements for it, and to start mapping that out. Because it's the classic thing about the UK, we're a highly inventive, innovative country. We have one of the highest per person patent rates still in the world, but we just don't follow it all the way through. Whereas Japan, to some extent, certainly the US, some of the countries are much better later on. So we focus on the spark of creativity and innovation. We don't then think about, to use the metaphor, how that spark then lights a fire that can grow bigger and bigger and bigger. And some of the countries do think about that a little bit more and do use public funding, but also leverage private funding for it. And that's not enough part of our discussion around economic growth and wealth creation.
Okay. We couldn't leave this podcast without discussing Brexit. I wondered how you anticipate Brexit will impact on the Cumbrian economy. If we can make the assumptions, because the government says this is what it wants, that we will leave the single market and we won't be in the customs union. If that's the case, how do you anticipate it will affect Cumbria?
So I'm going to slightly dodge the question in the sense that I think it's almost impossible to say what Brexit will look like now. And I think, if you, whatever your position on it now or when the referendum happened, I don't think it's played out in the way that anybody expected. So it's almost, it's a $64 million question I almost can't ask. I mean, I guess the couple of observations I would make is, there is an increasing sort of voice about trying to be pragmatic about it, making the best of the situation that we're in. The challenge around that is I'm not sure we know sufficiently what the situation is and how it will unfold. So in a way that pushes for greater dialogue beyond Brexit and through any transition periods, and actually beyond that, between Britain and the EU. And actually in a way that might be the glue that brings trading agreements and partnerships together. But it really is almost, impossible to say. And if you listen to CBI and others, that's the point they're fundamentally making is, in a way what they're saying is they're not taking an ideological position on Brexit. They just want to know what's going to happen so that their businesses can start planning for it. And that's the problem at the moment, is it's a bit of a guessing game. I think from, if I take us back to, Lancaster University as a university, we have students from all over Europe each year. when Brexit was first discussed, a lot of universities were very nervous about losing those students because they're excellent students and they're a key part of our diversity in terms of our student population. But if you step back, just think about it, this way. I mean, we attract students to the UK to study undergraduate degrees, and we attract a lot across the whole of the UK. Each year they borrow £9,250 on the student loan. If you go to a university in any country in Europe, and you're going to a public university, as still the most are in most countries, you're paying roughly between 500 and 800 or 900 euros a year. So people at the moment are deciding to not to spend less than €1,000, so 750, 800 pounds a year, and to take on £9,250 worth of debt because they see the quality of the higher education system in the UK. So what that says to me is that actually, if you look at universities as one example of a strong UK sector, there are decisions by people from Europe to come here to enjoy that product because of its quality. I don't see that changing. Some might be put off a little bit post-Brexit, but I don't see that fundamental changing. And I suspect you could look at that for other sectors in the UK as well. But with that caveat I said at the beginning, the problem at the moment is we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, true. All right. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Great. Thank you very much as well.